Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Welcome on in. Lovely to see everyone. Welcome, Allan. Thank you so much for joining us today, Allan. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Good, thanks. I love how we're asking each other like we didn't just have this whole 20-minute long conversation prior. Oh goodness. Allan, do you wanna introduce yourself and just give a brief little breakdown on what the Wagadu Chronicles is and what kind of things people in the chat can expect from the project?
Yeah. So my name is Allan. I'm based in Berlin and Accra, depending on the weather, and I'm heading a game development studio called Twin Drums. We're currently working on the Wagadu Chronicles, which is an African-inspired, like pre-colonial African-inspired fantasy setting, and it's both a tabletop role-playing game setting for D&D 5th edition and an MMORPG for PC, which will be releasing in the next couple of years.
Awesome. So, Allan, the one thing that I wanted to ask you, I don't know, I wanted to save this for later in the chat, but I can't hold on to it anymore. What I want to know is, will the physical copies of the player's handbook be available post Kickstarter?
That's a great question. And actually, what I can say is like, there's a very likelihood of this happening.
Okay. Okay. All right. I'm glad to hear that. That's fantastic.
Yes.
First of all, what inspired you to create an Afrocentric MMORPG? Not that, it isn't obvious that there is a lacking of that nature of game in that genre, but specifically for you, what made that a process for you?
Yeah, so it definitely comes from a place of me loving fantasy. I was, I think, 11 or 12 when I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, and I literally was glued to the book. Like it was on holidays in Christmas, and I just hid somewhere and read the book. Same for The Hobbit. I was actually visiting an aunt, a Ghanaian aunt in Switzerland, and I just spent most of that holiday in the forest, not far from where she lived, reading The Hobbit, which was really lovely. And I just realized I love fantasy, and I've been running the D&D games since I was 14, so more than 20 years ago. You can guess my age.
I won't, because I'm bad at math.
Okay. Yeah, gay maths, as I said.
Yeah, exactly. The only gay that could do maths was Alan Turing, and they didn't treat him very good about that, hey?
Yeah.
So ever since then we've decided, we learned our lesson. We're not going to do math anymore.
Nope.
If I may ask, it's not related to Wagadu, but where in Switzerland was this experience?
So close to Geneva, actually, on the very border between Geneva, so the Francophone part, and France.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, really beautiful.
Switzerland is one of my most favorite places in the whole world. So yeah.
Oh yeah, it's really lovely. I feel very poor when I go there. I don't know how it is for you, but like even at McDonald's is like the most expensive restaurant.
Yes.
And I'm like,
yeah,
so that's the only thing.
I'm very fortunate that both times I went, I was dating someone. So my ex-boyfriend is Swiss, and my boyfriend before him was also Swiss. No relation. It was just a coincidence.
I see a pattern there.
Any Swiss boys in the chat? But yeah, I can imagine how that must have inspired you to fall in love with fantasy, because Switzerland is so much like a fairy tale in a lot of places. Yes. But particularly, and obviously, as someone who is born in Zimbabwe and raised in Zimbabwe and lives in South Africa now, I obviously have quite an invested interest in the Afro fantasy component of Wagadu Chronicles. Obviously, as a white person, I understand that it's something that is separate from my cultural inclination, but I think it's very important to me that the indigenous people of the areas that I've called home for my whole life have something to enjoy the way that I have enjoyed the more Western components of Dungeons and Dragons and 5th edition tabletop role-playing games in general. But also, it's so lovely for me to see a game, or rather a campaign setting set in a game that is very close to my heart, using themes and motifs that are also quite close to my heart, as they make up a large portion of my developmental childhood. So specifically from an Afro fantasy perspective, tell us about that. What was the research process like? And tell us a little bit about your team and how they contribute to that environment.
Yeah, so there was definitely a personal journey related to the creation of the Wagadu Chronicles. I mean, as many dungeon masters out there, I've created some settings before, for fun, and at some point I realized that for many years, all of the worlds I was creating, or just like the worlds I was, official worlds playing in, did not have people that looked like me.
Yeah.
And I'm very fortunate because I got to live in Ghana as well. I have a strong connection with the continent. I speak 2 languages and so on. So eventually, I think it just kind of clicked. It's like, why am I running games and always role-playing characters that are white, based on very Eurocentric, on European medieval times or Renaissance? And then I just thought, like, let me look at my other side of the heritage and see what I can do. And then I realized that it kind of grew and became a bigger thing because there's, luckily my family has a lot of history and kind of kept a lot of the, even from the 19th century, I know a lot of my ancestors even before. But then, the more I was digging, the more I realized a lot was kind of hard to find, not on the internet. I had to buy books and speak with ancestors, with elders and so on. And then it kind of became a bigger thing, and not just Ghanaian inspired, but the whole continent. And it's been actually an anti-colonial act. Because very clearly colonialism was about destroying all of this and then turning Africa through the language, the clothing, everything into another Europe with black folks, I guess. But there's so much there. The continent is so rich. So it created like this interesting anti-colonial adventure. And the team has been very important too, and it's great that you're asking. Thanks, because roughly half of the team is POC and more than half of these people are black. Mostly based in Europe, though in Nigeria as well, in Ghana. And it's been a personal journey because most of us are African European, and so we had to grow up to navigating this space of like, we're representing Africa all the time, or specific countries, but we have to survive within a white dominated space. Like in the town where I grew up, I was one of the only black kids. Like high school, 500 kids, I was the only black person at some point. So it was, then my sister came, just 2 of us. So there was a lot of personal journey as well, of kind of rediscovering our own identities.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And that must also be quite alienating in a lot of ways. And from my own personal experience, I grew up in a country where Black Indigenous people were the majority and I was the minority. And yet still, when I play these games, they're always white characters. And I actually remember, I think what made me start becoming really passionate about creating Afrocentric homebrewed campaign modules for my tabletop role-playing settings was I had one of my best friends, is obviously a black person, that's why it's relevant to the story. He wanted to play an elf, and we were sitting around a table, and I don't want to it was a long time ago, and I'm not going to mention specifically who this person was, but so he wanted to play an elf, and then he was describing his elf and then said something about the color of his skin, and another player said, oh, then you should be a drow, which is the dark elves. And then he was like, yeah, exactly. And they're the only race of elves that are evil. And it's like, with the exception of obviously Drizzt Rowe, but I mean like one elf who breaks from the norm of evilness. And I felt like really crushed for him by that, because it never occurred to me before. And obviously as a white person, sometimes we can be blinded to the facets of our own privilege, because because racial discrimination is just not a part of our lived narrative, at least on a systemic level. I don't know about anything else. I haven't experienced that as a white person. And I said, actually, I'm okay with having a high elf who's black. Like, they don't have to be dark elves, And so how I had like homebrewed it, because I also wanted it to be lore friendly, and unfortunately I had to do a lot of thinking there, which I shouldn't have to do. It should actually just be baked into the lore. I had to look into how elves were created and how they are made from the bones of a fallen celestial and how they self-actualize based on their Fey ancestry. And I was like, oh, they self-actualize based on their environment. So if you're a black elf, then you are in an environment in which having black skin is conducive to your environment and survivability. So, you know, what of it? Like, you know, and that's for the first time I was like, I had to work really hard just to make somebody a black elf in a way that made them comfortable. And I was like, I shouldn't have to do that, you know? And it occurred to me for the first time that a lot of these fantasy genres that we look at are incredibly Eurocentric and Afro-avoidant, I would say. We've got a comment here with alias Trench, who says, I, for one, have adopted the headcanon of the drow being Australian. We're from down under, we get a lot of snakes, and we're kind of descended from convicts and spies. Yeah, I also don't like, I also stay away from like evil races in my campaign module, so I don't use orcs as like the evil race or the drow as the evil race. I like to think of them as races that are commonly misunderstood. And yeah, I don't know, it seems like something that a lot of the tabletop role-playing community is very thankfully steering away from. So yeah. I feel like I had a question in here somewhere for you, Allan, and I just went on a tangent and never actually got to ask it.
Well, maybe I can comment on the topic of evil
please.
Races. Yeah, and I think that's another thing. Like, you know, the Wagadu Chronicles is not just about let's take Western fantasy how it is and then kind of paint it black, like kind of just change the skin colors and then kind of change a bit the armors and the buildings and so on. That's it. So there's many ideas that are being challenged in the Wagadu Chronicles. One of them too is like this concept of evil races. So even the concept of race itself, because Wagadu's folks have lineages. Mm-hmm. So yes, you'd manifest them in like, for instance, having horns or like pointed ears or being able, you know, being hairy and being able to turn into lions and so on. But it's something that represents a connection to your ancestors, and it can change throughout your life as well. So you can transition, it's rare, but you can transition from one lineage to another. And lineages too, like, are not necessarily bound to cultures. So cultures and lineages are separate. So it's not like in the real world, like if you see the two of us, it's not that because you are like lighter skin, then you have to belong to a European culture, because you actually belong to an African culture. And well, I guess I'm in between, but like I'm a multi-classing, but yeah, between West African and European cultures. So it's actually, that's another thing. There's a split between cultures and origins, and these origins to like play around ancestral connections that can actually change, because in the end, you kind of have all of the ancestors somewhere in your past. And you end up manifesting a specific one.
That's actually a really incredible way to challenge those social constructs and dynamics. I think that's very, very interesting. And Amaranth says in the chat, not only Eurocentric, but more often than not, Orientalistic, which obviously being patronizing towards anything that isn't inside said Eurocentrism. And obviously, Amaranth, to expand on that comment, Orientalistic normally pertains to being patronizing towards Eastern cultures and demographics. So, for example, I know that there's the latest discourse on the tabletop role-playing community about the monk class. I personally have started referring to the monk class as the pugilist class, because it basically means the same thing, but it doesn't have this like exotified Eastern kind of component to it that has nothing to do with the class itself, unless the character themselves are of a sort of Eastern-centric background. So I think that's also very interesting. And on that note, I wanted to ask you, Allan, what's about... I've got the handbook in front of me, so we can take a look at that together. At least I did have it in front. Oh, here it is. So the classes in the game, I'm trying to figure out what page we're looking at for classes. We've got Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Paladin, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Hunter, and Rogue. But those are obviously like the Eurocentric names, which you've put there for a wider audience to help them understand and transition into what these classes actually mean from a a cultural contextualization. So we've got barbarians are spiritual warriors, bards are griots, cleric is priest, druids are witch doctors, and fighters are obviously fighters. I mean, it's the word itself. Monk, ancestral wrestlers, rogues are rogues, paladin, shrine warrior, ranger, hunter, and wizard alawo. And I mean, this is really incredible and shows, at least from my understanding of these dynamics, an incredible amount of care to the background. And you have obviously a deep connection to the narratives here, but this is very cross-cultural. And so even for you, this must have taken, and you and your team collectively, massive amounts of research. So how was that process? Explain, like, obviously sitting around with the team and researching these things, because I know that when I tried to make an Afrocentric elf homebrew, I was looking at the Amera elves, and then I also saw them on the handbook as well. So what was your favorite part about researching all of these robust cultures?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, that's a big question. Let me see how to answer.
Yeah.
No, but it's a good one.
Vague as well.
Yeah. And by the way, you see, like, ancestral wrestlers similar to your pugilists, so I guess we're heading in the same direction.
Yeah,
yeah.
No, you go.
Okay, then. I mean, one thing that is important to say is that deciding to go for the 5th edition of D&D, as much as I love it, means that certain parameters and frameworks that are Eurocentric have been kept within the Wagadu Chronicles, and I'm still satisfied with the overall result. But I think, like, the way things, like even the mechanics of fantasy within D&D have the Eurocentric element. Like just an example, if you look at especially West African mythology and tradition, smiths are some of the most powerful magicians, whereas, like, you do have in Eurocentric fantasy, because of Tolkien and so on, the idea that magic and smith are like dwarves and elves, so there's an opposition, right? There's a contrast between the two. Whereas if you look at, like, for instance, Mande smiths in West Africa, they are seen as some of the most powerful witch and wizards and so on. So and those were trickier parts because to kind of balance, because the system is literally made with those ideas in mind. But still, that said, like, a lot of things are similar as well, right? So you do have hunters, you do have alawos, which are basically a kind of the Nigerian version of oracles and wizards. The idea too of, like, shrines that need to be protected has been there in many African traditional religions. Therefore, the paladin kind of becomes a shrine warrior. So I think it was not, as hard. It was more like, kind of, where do we compromise a bit? How do we make things fit in? And it was an interesting process that worked out quite well, I find. But for the MMORPG, there's going to be many more roles because the game is skill-based. So actually, you can build a much more variety. You're not stuck with the idea of class, which is based on kind of Western fantasy.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually did want to talk more about the MMORPG itself. I actually, admittedly, I haven't kept up as much with the MMORPG side of the project as I have with the tabletop role-playing side. But currently, is there a way for people to test out what is available, or is that a future development?
It's a future, but very soon. So this winter, this winter I'll have the first alpha for backers of the Kickstarter. But we're looking for ways to involve other people who did not back. Like, maybe we might have some weekends or something. So
I'll keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, if you keep an eye, we say more about this. But already, for sure, next year there'll be ways to play the Wagadu Chronicles before the game releases. Okay,
fantastic. I'm also looking at the page that talks about the items in Wagadu, and it's amazing, all of these terms that are very familiar to me as someone who's lived his whole life in Africa that might not be familiar to other people, like the calabash and the fetishes, or as some as we call them in Zimbabwe, the fetishes are the nkisi. I don't know if you know the term Nkisi.
Yeah.
I actually did an art project on Nkisi fetishes in when I was in high school, which I pretty wish I could redo as an adult.
And you can use it. You can use it for the Wagadu Chronicles.
I can actually, yeah. And something that really kind of struck an emotional chord with me is the Ambeda as a musical instrument. Every time I hear even the sound of an Ambeda, I get very emotional. I remember once Google, you know how Google does those event things and they change the logo of Google and stuff, and they once did a feature on Zimbabwe and Zimbabwean culture. I don't remember why, to be honest. They featured Ambeda music, and I just went through everything.
I think I played. You could actually play the Ambeda.
Yes, yeah. Oh, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. So I want to ask you, what character in Wagadu have you chosen for yourself? Your character background and stuff. Give us your character background. I'll give you mine afterwards. I need to think about it.
It's an interesting question because so far I've only run games, but for the tabletop side. But I have a test character created for when we test internally the MMORPG, and from there I created a very old Swala person who's going around and trying to share wisdom that's not always very functional. So that's what I have. Like a very self-absorbed Swala.
Okay.
I actually played for a couple of sessions online streamed for the 3 Black Halflings, if you know them, who actually like very awesome Black streamers from the US, South Africa, and the UK, all Black. And they run a game that I participated in, and they've been collaborating with us for the Wagadu Chronicles.
Can you give me their name again?
3 Black Halflings.
3 Black Halflings. I thought that's what you said, but I thought I heard wrong.
Yeah, and they're awesome. I really recommend you should speak with them. And
I'd love to. Where can I find them? Is that okay? I found them on Twitter. Are they on like Twitch and YouTube?
Yeah, I think they stream.
Oh, they have a link tree. I can just find it all from here.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and they actually run a whole campaign set in the Wagadu Chronicles.
That's amazing. Oh, they've also got a podcast. Okay, thank you for sharing this with me. I love looking for D&D podcasts. I've been getting quite into them lately. I'm currently with
awesome streamers too. So
yeah, I'll definitely check them out there. I've recently started listening to Join the Party. Do you know Join the Party? They're an LGBTQI plus inclusive Dungeons and Dragons podcast, but like exclusively podcast. So there's no video or anything, but they edit the sounds really well. And let me quickly give the link to the 3 Black Halflings in chat for Africa Games Week. Oh, we've also got Africa Games Week in chat. And unless I'm mistaken, Allan, you've been in an interview with Rex Africa Games Week as well.
Yes.
Okay. I like to do a little bit of background research when I speak to people. Yes. So I saw one of your videos. I thought it was very cool.
I'm glad you didn't ask me what I spoke about, because I was like, let me remember.
I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
Exactly. Like
yeah.
I think I spoke about the Wagadu Chronicles. So far, I can
Africa Games Week says Allan presented last year at AGW, Africa Games Week. Yeah. I mean, I'd be surprised if they didn't. You were perfect for that kind of environment. And I'm really glad that we have something like that in Africa. I often feel like a lot of African geek culture and gaming culture is very reliant on international sources, and it's really nice to see more grassroots, homebrewed, if you will, things like that going on here. I mean, we haven't had Comic-Con Africa for more than two occasions. I think we've only had Comic-Con Africa twice, and then we were supposed to have it last year. And then something very interesting happened last year. The whole world shut down.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. King Hellfire says the art that's been released thus far for Wagadu is absolutely magnificent. Would love to hear more about it. I also would love to hear more about it. But for some context, Allan, King Hellfire is my editor, and he is a graphic designer and illustrator. Really brilliant work. And he's also followed by Lady Gaga because of his illustration. Wow. So this is some high praise, Allan. I'm just letting you know.
Oh, thank you. I'm getting the vicarious Lady Gaga. So
me too.
A little part of Lady Gaga is through you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very lucky because I have an awesome team. And our director, Iga, she's originally Polish, but it's actually, I'll say the full story. It's quite interesting what happened there with the art, because the first person I collaborated with was Black African. But I think it shows a lot about how intersectional the project is, and this is trigger warning, a bit of like a sad homophobic story. And after working for the first 8 months of the project, it was still a side project at the time, with this person, a super cool international artist. At some point he was like, wait, but are you gay yourself? And I was like, yeah, it's pretty obvious, I just never mentioned. And he literally, after creating lots of concepts and working together, told me that he did not want to work on the Wagadu Chronicles anymore, and actually, yeah, completely stepped out from the project and asked his art not to be shared anymore. And that was actually like a near-death experience for the project. Yeah, really sad. And the reason was his religion doesn't allow him to work on my project. And yeah, that was a bit of a turning moment in two ways. So one was like, okay, what do I do now? And the second was I realized I should be even more queer positive with the project. So after that, I mean, as a gay man, it's already been, an important element of the setting. But after that, I was, I don't want this to happen anymore. I was lucky then, because then Iga, the current art director, joined, and she's awesome. And like, even as a European person, she's just spent so much time researching. She's been literally on the continent and spent like a week and a half somewhere in the savannah, which I would never do. So I was like, wow, I admire the focus. And the team too is like now super diverse with lots of Black folks and so on. But this experience was really useful to realize that, yeah, I have to be super, super open to about the queer element. And so that kind of pushed, it's not, I guess, what this person wanted, but they pushed the setting to be even more queer, like the gods and everything is like very, very queer.
I think that's a great takeaway. If somebody pushes back against this project for what it's doing in terms of promoting these beautiful and diverse narratives that include, but not limited to, queerness, then you push back even harder and be like, well, actually, what we're doing is very cool, and my religion doesn't allow for homophobia. So,
There you go.
And actually, on that note, I found no, thank you, Allan. I'm really glad that you did that. I'm not glad that happened to you. That's actually profoundly shocking. Wow, I can't say that I've never heard of that happening, because that's not true. But yeah, I'm just really shocked that happened to you, especially considering the nature of your project. But on that note, I found a very lovely segment on the Player's Handbook, which, by the way, actually, I want everybody to be able to do this with me. Let me find it. You get a free Player's Handbook with an email subscription to the Wagadu Chronicles, and I'm trying to find it right now, and I'm being really dumb in that I can't find it. It's literally right on the page in front of my face. I'm so dumb.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Let me put the link here. So that's the main website for the Wagadu Chronicles, but if you want to sign up to get the free 300-page PDF rulebook for the Wagadu Chronicles tabletop role-playing, which I highly recommend. I've read through it, and it is such a brilliant compilation of work from the whole team. And also, obviously, subscribing means that you keep in touch with Wagadu, you see the updates that are coming through, and also you support the project itself, which is amazing. So everybody, I encourage you all to go and take a look at that link, send in your email. Allan is not going to send you pictures of his breakfast or walks in the park. It's only going to be like Wagadu related. Hey, Allan. But if you can send...
For now.
Yeah, for now. You can send me pictures of your breakfast. I don't mind. I'm a foodie. King says, I've never subscribed to a newsletter so fast. I know. I don't think I've ever subscribed to a newsletter in my life, except for this one. But the section to which I'm referring is the Society in Wagadu section of the book that talks about timekeeping in Wagadu, gender and sexuality, concepts of nudity, or rather the social concepts of nudity, pre-colonial sexuality. And what I really love about this section is that you also recommend some reading material that explains real-world concepts of homosexuality in traditional African cultures, such as Boy Wives and Female Husbands, Studies in African Homosexualities by Stephen O'Murray and Will Roscoe. And then disabilities in Wagadu. So you mentioned earlier about the intersexual nature of the Wagadu Chronicles. And I think that really comes through in such lovely praxis when I get to a section like this and I see that you do uplift all of these demographics that have been negatively affected by discrimination and bigotry under the umbrella of perhaps colonization, perhaps patriarchy. And I don't mean to throw around terms that some people might find like BuzzFeed terms, but these are real concepts that have had real world consequences for a lot of these marginalized communities. And I love to see that Wagadu promotes these communities in such a meaningful way. Tell us about that and how much the team has influenced these narratives, because I know that you have a very lovely and extensive team. Not extensive, you're a small team, which is what makes this a passion project, but your team is more than like you and someone else.
Yeah, definitely. There's a team then. We're actually about 12 people currently and keep on growing slowly. And that's most of the team is focused on the video game because the production of a requires people power, but definitely there's like especially the writer Kika and I kind of the main folks on the writing side of things with collaborations, which we'll be sharing more about in the future.
Sorry to interrupt you. Who's your writer?
So it's Kika.
Kika.
And yes, she's for instance she posts the Kickstarter updates. That's her. So we actually have open updates on the Kickstarter campaign. You can check them, and basically every month we share like updates on what's going on, both with the TTRPG stuff and the MMORPG stuff.
Are they on Twitter by any chance?
Yes, not. I have a very shy team, so not very active.
Okay.
But right. she's on Twitter. You'll find her. Yeah. If you go on the Twin Drums handle and see who Twin Drums follows, it's basically all of the team, and you'll find Tika as well. Yeah.
And for everyone in chat, Twin Drums on Twitter is this here.
Yeah.
Sorry, Allan, I interrupted you, and you were continuing what you were saying about the team.
And about the queerness, right? Like how it's influenced. And I think it's interesting it was not something planned, like I actually wrote it anywhere, but I think around half of the team identifies as queer, and that's very, many overlap as well, like Black and queer. And, I actually had recently one of my employees telling me that for the first time in their life, they didn't have to pick between being Black or queer. And that was actually such a touching moment for me. Like I was really very touched, because it's something that I've done before, and I think many Black folks do go through this experience of like, because of colonialism and what happened, we have to navigate often like spaces that are Black but homophobic, or white and homophobic as well, but then sometimes you go to places that are not homophobic and more queer positive, but then are very white, and they can be even racist. And Twin Drums is both. It's both like queer positive and of course anti-racist and pro-Black and pro-POC. And then you realize there's not that many places like this out there, especially professionally. And so that's a very personal connection for us. But I think one trigger too was literally history, because if you go and look, it's awesome that you mentioned the book before, which I quote. But Africa had a lot of queer traditions. Like I'm not saying that there wasn't patriarchy we cannot romanticize African history either, because there were all sorts of things. There was often polygamy that was mostly for men, although, if you think, you'll find interesting things with women as well. But like superficially, there was some patriarchy, but then there were a lot of in-betweens. There were like, often patriarchy was not as strict as in the West. You did have some matriarchies, you still do in some parts of the continent, and you have a lot of queer like third genders, or kind of like from cross-dressing to like marriages between women and men. There's so much going on, or like even like genders being defined in different ways from ours, ancestors being defined as their own gender, which is something that happens in the Wagadu Chronicles as well. If you look at the history, it's literally, and you're doing an Afro fantasy game, an African-inspired fantasy game, you cannot just have Western patriarchy there and Western homophobia. That just doesn't. It would be a lie, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's difficult for me because you've mentioned that you've seen some of my content on TikTok, and I obviously talk about various intersectional issues that are important to me. but I also understand that I talk about these issues contextualized by the fact that I am, for the discrimination I face as a queer person, I do exist on the intersection of privilege in that I'm both cis, I'm male, and I am cisgendered male white person, and I often find it difficult to talk about these things without coming across as condescending or disrespectful. In that I do make mention quite frequently of the fact that a lot of homophobia is in fact a facet of colonization in African cultures, but I also don't want to dictate to these people who have internalized that homophobia as a component of their upbringing or their ideals, to now then say to them that they have fallen prey to colonial ideals. And in my home country, Zimbabwe, you might not be aware, but being gay is actually still a crime. And it's really unfortunate because homophobia is not indigenous to Zimbabwe, and homophobia as a concept, and certainly as a legislation, was only introduced through colonization. So I'm really glad that that's something that the Wagadu Chronicles highlights, because for me, the Wagadu Chronicles is more than just a game, both MMORPG and tabletop role-playing, but it's also a system by which we disrupt other facets of the gaming of the gaming industry and gaming as a genre, and so I think that's really incredible. But speaking of Zimbabwe, and we spoke about this earlier, and I mentioned, tell me about your character, I'll tell you about mine. So I have decided that when I play the Wagadu Chronicles, both on the MMORPG and on the tabletop role-playing, I'm going to be in Emere, which, if you want to, for those in the chat, if you want to have a close reference to what Emere are, they're a type of fae folk, similar to owls, but my lineage is going to be... I need to remember this one, Allan. I'm not going to lie to you. It's been a while since I took a look at this part of the Discord. The one that's based in Zimbabwe and Shona and Ndebele culture. I'm trying to remember. That is
the lion blood.
The lion blood. Yes, I was going to say. I was going to say lion, but I was like, but there's also the you need to explain to me the difference between the lineage and the...
So the
classes,
cultures. Cultures, exactly.
Yeah.
So you kind of have, so in this case, your character will have lineage like more Fey, Emere, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But we get like one of the cultures from the lion blood. You can do that. It's a super interesting character. I'm actually really curious to see how that would play out. Maybe we should run a session or something.
I would love that. Don't even tempt me with a good time. I'll hold you to that, actually. I think it would be quite interesting because there is a cultural disparity between the lion blood and the Emere in terms of real world geography, but like you've mentioned before, Wagadu is not supposed to be representative of real world. It's supposed to be representative of the core values and attributes of Afro fantasy and Afrocentrism. But I also thought it might be nice because there is a sort of cross-cultural amalgamation there. And as somebody who obviously is not indigenous to Africa, but has been born and raised in Africa, I do have some insight into what it's like playing that kind of role in real life. And I would like to kind of introduce that into a tabletop role-playing setting. But what I wanted to... Yeah, I also, I'd love to see it as well, because I don't know how I'm going to do it. But I'll try. What I wanted to ask you, Allan, is... a lot of the promo messages you post for Wagadu talk about how NPCs in the game can actually, like the NPC role, the quest giver and the market person can actually be real players. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the pillars of the Wagadu Chronicles video game version. Is like, whereas most MMORPGs are about you going into a world, online world, and just like speaking out of character and just talking about your stuff, you know, whatever you want about the real world, as long as you're not offensive. In theory, although we know many of these places are very, very toxic. In this case, the online space of the Wagadu Chronicle is a safe space for role playing, which means that everybody is expected to speak in character. And that's something that currently exists mostly in niche spaces. I mean, they're also niche if you think about, I don't know, GTA, online role play, you know, there's lots of famous servers where this happens. Most big MMOs have like servers that are called RP, so dedicated to role playing, but they're usually like a second thought after the main kind of, you know, non-roleplay focused servers. So we're kind of flipping it over. It's like, for us, the roleplay element is the most important. So if you want to come from roleplaying and roleplay online, we're creating this through mechanics, through moderation, everything, making this a safe space so that you can act out with potentially hundreds of people online.
That's incredible. I am an avid role player in MMORPGs. Back when I was playing World of Warcraft quite religiously, and I'm glad, obviously, given the recent scandal, that I've put that down for a good year and a half now. But I used to be on Argent Dawn, which is the European role-playing server. And I'm currently clinically addicted to Final Fantasy XIV.
Okay.
And I've been desperately trying to break into the role-playing scene of Final Fantasy XIV. But Final Fantasy XIV, the role-playing community is quite big, but it's not very coherent in that, you know, people... WoW, to WoW's credit, WoW has a lot more... WoW has a lot more filler lore in the game than Final Fantasy XIV, even though I prefer personally the story of Final Fantasy XIV. But I think that allows players to do more with that in terms of their specific character. Like, Final Fantasy XIV doesn't focus too much on what your race or your class is, or your background even, whereas World of Warcraft does. And so I really like the idea of going into an MMORPG where that is actually a component of the focus. So that's very interesting, and I love that idea. I think
you're literally like the perfect audience for the game.
Exactly, yeah. This game was targeted to me.
Exactly.
Yeah. You can tell me if the game was made just for me and you didn't want me to feel like pressured, so you like, you know, pretended it was for everyone else.
You discovered me, you got me.
I found out your secret. We actually had a comment earlier in chat that I didn't get a chance to ask you. Will pre-orders similar to the backing packages be available again before the full release?
So I can say that there'll be something. It's not going to be exactly like the Kickstarter campaign, because, you know, I think out of respect for the backers that they kind of took a risk at the very early stage. Those are unique, but there will be some elements of those kind of early accesses and so on that will be available down the line. So yes, details to come in future. Okay.
You mentioned earlier that your character that you had chosen is Swala. So I'm looking at them. I'm looking at all these different lineages now. We've got the Ikaki, the Asiman, Ayeren, Inzifoyama, Emere, Dama, and Swala. Can you explain Swala to us?
Yeah. So I'll say as a disclaimer straight away, I love all of the lineages. So just to like down the line, people to look at this video and go like, oh wait, Allan like gave stronger stats to Swalas because he loves Swalas. I know how these things develop, so I don't want
I'm changing my lineage now.
Exactly, like kind of drama when the game releases, people looking back at videos, like digging around. So actually I'll say I equally support all of the lineages. And actually Swala, I just have a thing for horns. I really love the idea of having horns. And so I really like when I run games, like D&D games, and create NPCs, and so I love role-playing all of them. I think Swala was just something about having horns. I really like cows as well. I'm a vegan too, so maybe there's that factor as well. Yeah, there you go. So, and interestingly, more than half of the team is vegan. Again, another thing that actually wasn't a prerequisite for the job description, but we ended up, I think there is something too about it's a bit off topic, but like how when you become very respectful about, and mindful about humanity and, and people that are different from you and so on, it kind of spills over other species as well at some point.
I think there is
I'm not saying you have to, right? But there is a bit of a correlation.
I think there is a social correlation. For example, most of the most of the people that I know who are vegan are also very proactive feminists. I have a friend actually who runs a farm animal sanctuary. She rescues farm animals. She's got 226 animals on this private property of hers that she just looks after. It's really lovely to see these animals that would otherwise have, been sold for food at like less than a quarter of their lifespan actually live till they get to old age. And we're and it's such a lovely environment up there as well. I sometimes take trips just to say hi. And I bring her vegan wine from town. And it's just lovely because she's also she's a feminist, and she thinks that all of these intersectional issues fall under the umbrella and the category of compassion. And for those in chat, if you're not vegan or vegetarian, no one's saying that you're not compassionate. Don't worry. Like, we're not. There's a specific TikToker called That Vegan Teacher that has been like, have you heard of That Vegan Teacher?
Yes, I heard.
Part of me actually feels bad for her, but the other part of me is like, what are you doing?
Yes, I think I feel the same.
Yeah. But aside from that, I'm looking at all these different. So there are combinations. Iron Masters, Daima, Asiman, Hayeren, Asiman, Izingonyama. What's Izingonyama? It sounds very
basically
familiar.
the lion. It's the lion blood.
Okay.
It's another name for the lion blood. Yes, so
Okay.
it's lions. I think it's actually lion in. It's actually the word for a lion in Zulu.
Yes, I think it is. I'll tell you why. Because in Shona and Ndebele, the word for lion is Isiloane. And when I started saying that when I moved to South Africa, people used to laugh at me because I know that isiXhosa and some of Zulu has similar words with Shona and Ndebele. But in isiXhosa, for example, which is the indigenous language in South Africa, for those who don't know, Alan, you probably do know, Isiloane means big animal. And I don't actually know what the word lion means here, but I don't know. I don't even know how I would have brought that up when I came here, but I remember that sticking, that Isiloane is Shona and Ndebele and not a part of the Nguni languages here. So did you know that, by the way, that Isiloane means lion in Shona?
I did not, but I actually love this because I'm really curious to see how players will bring more lore into the setting, because there's so many cultures around the continent that there's just a ton, and the lineages are actually a blend of various cultures and fantasy archetypes, which leaves open a lot of room for players to create additional subcultures and to add more. So I'm very excited to see, like maybe your character coming up with like maybe lion blood culture, but having different names based on some other languages, so maybe Shona. So it's super interesting. Like, I love that.
Well, it's what I'm seeing here on this page 48, for those who have the PDF open. The sun and moon cultures, the combination of lineage and culture determines so much about your character. For example, if you are Ikaki and lion blood, you are part of the Bintu. Or if you're Ikaki and Emere, you are the Coral people. Ikaki and Daima, you are the Warana. And I think that's amazing that you have these, not only people can blend culture and lineage to create something new, but that there are actually established facets of these communities that people can read up on and feel like there's really a dynamic and idiosyncratic part of their character that they can look up even, which I think is incredible. And I don't know of any game that does that. So that's incredible.
Thank you. I think it was very important for me to move away from this ethno-nationalism, which we see in a lot of Western fantasy. The idea that if you are a dwarf, you belong to dwarven culture and you follow dwarven gods. So because in the end, it comes from the idea of like, I grew up all of my life with people trying to define who I was just by looking at me, which is complicated because as a mixed race, I was called white a lot of the time in Africa, believe it or not, and maybe not in South Africa, but in West Africa a lot, and called black throughout most of Western Europe, where I spent most of my life. And so I very much learned quickly that this is just such a flawed concept because I saw it on myself. It's like I am an in-between, and my cultures are both like West African and West European. And I think having that concept very clear in the Wagadu Chronicles, that you have a certain ancestral lineage that defines how maybe you look like, that your culture can be much more and can be a blend of the influence of different lineages. So that was super important for me to have. And so far, the first feedback is that players are really loving this.
I mean, I'm not surprised. I personally am also very much loving that component. Speaking of things that I'm loving, Allan, the more I go through this handbook, the more I'm in love with the artwork. And I've just got to the section with the Daima, who are the cursed, or the moon people, the winged folk. And they have this sort of regal moth aesthetic, and they've got different looks based on like the moon and rural versus urban, and they are so majestic to look at. And part of the reason is that these illustrations are so incredible. Who is the artist here, if I may ask?
So
you mentioned earlier.
Most of what you say is like Iga, the art director, who I mentioned. But then there's some other collaborators as well. And we had actually for the book collaborators from Kenya, from Brazil, from North America, of course Europe, and with lots of different POC backgrounds or white. It's actually queer, non-queer, so a very, very interesting mix of people. And at the time, because we had no money at that stage, pre-Kickstarter and everything, it was all volunteering, which was super awesome too. It was like just super nice people saying like, hey, as a busy, amazing artist, I'm going to give a bit of time to help with this project. So I'm super, super grateful with those artists, and they're actually listed in the book, and you should check them out because they're all awesome.
I am doing that right now. Unfortunately, though, I clicked on the Iga Oliwiak link. Some of the links, obviously, Allan, you mentioned that there's going to be an updated version of the PDF. Yeah. Some of the links I found, not most of them, just for like one or two, are in need of an update. But for those who are interested, I did find Iga, I think, on Twitter. I'm not 100% sure. The Twitter name.
Very active.
Yeah, the Twitter name isn't Iga though, and yet somehow I found. Oh, I know why. I know what's going on.
It's Ixon art.
Got it. Okay, now I got it.
Yeah, yeah. And if you look at the Twin Drums handle, I think it follows most of the team or collaborators. So that's a good way, easy way to track the artist as well.
That's Iga's Twitter page for those in chat who are interested. Allan, I've been asking a lot of questions of you. Do you have any questions for us as a community regarding your game?
Yeah.
Putting you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, but it's a great question. So I'm definitely very curious about what you'd expect from, what kind of the biggest differences you'd expect in an Afro fantasy setting? So, because the Wagadu Chronicles reflects like what I saw as peculiar for such a world. But I'm always curious, to see what others would expect, especially if you're African, have a strong connection, and maybe it can be inspiration for me, to add things eventually to the game.
I think for me, the one part of the campaign module for the tabletop role-playing setting specifically is I would love to see how, because obviously Dungeons and Dragons has quite a repertoire of campaign modules and history and stories and famous characters and things like that. And what I would like to see is going forward, do you plan to release campaign modules? For example, you've got the Wagadu handbook, obviously the same way that D&D has the player's handbook, but D&D has things like Baldur's Gate. Wow, I played D&D since I was like 11 years old, and I'm struggling to think of even a single campaign module. Mines of Fendelva. I have a few. A story like Ravenloft. Is that the one? Yeah. So like stories set in Wagadu that are self-contained stories. Are those campaign modules that you think over time Twin Drums will be releasing, or?
That's a very interesting question, because for sure we're releasing a book called The Seventh Era, which is coming. It's basically like the big campaign book, and have like it's like a much expanded version of the Player's Handbook, actually, Child and the Oath, which has an adventure there as well. But this is going to be like just a bigger campaign book with like there'll be a specific era of a specific time of Wagadu, which is going to be covered with maps, and there'll be like cities and much more lore, and it will delve more into the cultures and items and spells and so on. So it's like a bigger version of what you see there. And then potentially follow-ups in future, there might be some adventures, but for now the focus is this seventh.
Okay. On that note, though, Allan, I would literally probably die of excitement. I would literally burst into flames. I would transcend this mortal coil. If this is a big if, and don't feel any pressure to consider this. But do you know of a program called Tailspire?
No, I don't.
I think, okay, just keep it on the side there. You must take a look at it. Okay. It's a program that I use for my D&D campaigns. It's a 3D modeling program that, it's not a modeling program. It's a game that allows you to, they have like a library of terrain pieces and minis, and you can just basically build your own tabletop role-playing terrain. But it's not like some of these other ones that try to be too fancy or animate things. They literally look like the kind of minis you would get from Hero Forge. They literally look like the kind of terrain pieces you would get from Battle Bunker. No, not what's the other one. And they are looking. They came out a couple of weeks ago, and they've really taken the D&D market by storm, and really changed the game, as it were, and allowed us to visualize our campaigns a lot better. And what's really nice is that you can basically copy and paste, literally the way that you would copy and paste a Word document from one person's game to another, and they can give you like a code, and you copy and paste other people's builds into your game. And they are currently talking to Hero Forge about getting mini makers for them. But I think at the moment they're quite open to talking with like other campaign or D&D inspired groups and they like to release packages of minis and terrain pieces and stuff, and having something like a Wagadu Chronicles style mini and terrain package for Tailspire, because they are also an indie studio, so they'll probably be very open to a collaboration. I think, I'm just saying, I'm putting it out there, manifesting that maybe, that's something to consider for a future development. Don't know.
Definitely considering. So, yes, and we do want to get into more collaborations. And it's very much a top resource topic at this point, because we're a small team doing 2 projects at the same time. But this said, yes, like we're in talks already for some things, so I cannot go in details yet.
That's
but there'll
fine.
be more. Okay. And so yes, could be. But before you combust, I think it might take a while. But there could be news.
Okay, I'm going to maintain composure until such a time as I feel like that might be a possibility.
I'm share the link, so have a look.
Okay, awesome. I'll do that. Xanthias says, I'm curious if he's read any good fantasy with a similar setting or cultural inspiration. For instance, Evan Winters has similar cultural settings in his book, The Rage of Dragons, though the focus is primarily on military fantasy. I'm curious if Allan has any book, author, or game recommendations.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. Thank you, Xanthias. And I'll say 2 things. So I do have a couple of recommendations. Like I think I really like Nadia Okorafor, the Nigerian American writer. I think she did some really cool Afrofuturist, modern Afrofantasy. And then Tommy Adeyemi as well. I think both Nigerian Americans, so I think really cool. But I must say that I haven't read that much, and that's intentional, because my sources are mostly historical, pre-colonial Africa. So I've spent a lot of time reading about actual people and histories and kingdoms and folks and so on throughout the continent pre-colonization. And that's how I work in general. Like I really like to go to regional sources. I think like my fantasy creations are more authentic when I look at those, rather than going to someone else's work because it feels more derivative. So I kind of like to compare sometimes and look at what other people did, but I don't want to read too much because I don't want it to affect my world, if that makes sense. So.
That does make sense. I understand that as well. And then I feel like I've been asking a lot about the tabletop role-playing side, and I'm sure you want to talk about the MMO as well.
No, talk about both. Yeah, please.
So from the MMORPG perspective, I am somewhat of an MMORPG connoisseur, I'll have you know. So what I want to know is, with regards to that, what are we looking at in terms of a static storyline in Wagadu? Because obviously, you know, it's difficult to balance an open player role-playing environment without clashing with a set storyline. How is that balance in the Wagadu Chronicles, and how is the continuity of the storyline going to affect other parts of the gameplay?
So that's a super important question and very, very, very relevant for the Wagadu Chronicles. So first of all, one thing that's worth mentioning is that all the alphas and betas that are going to be run before the release of the game are set in the past of the world. So the lore of Wagadu is going to be built in these alpha and beta sessions. So what happens is going to become history for then the actual release of the game. And that's, first of all, one thing that actually shows continuity for our players too. I'm glad you like it.
I do.
And then, when the game releases, we're now going to have like a main plot, like in most theme park MMORPGs, like kind of World of Warcraft and so on. Yeah. It's going to be actually closer to a game like EVE Online or Albion Online. I mean, I know they're very different because they're much more battle focused, but it means that there's not going to be like a Lich King that everybody has to fight. It's going to be players creating their own factions, creating their own stories. And like if you, Nick, join the game and start like your own kind of like Lion Blood culture that is all about, I don't know, love and parties, then maybe like kind of spread throughout the world. That is the lore. Like the lore is like the spread of Nick's kingdom of love and lions throughout Wagadu. And what do other people want to do?
I will die. Okay, well, I'm literally going to be awake for 36 hours before the drop of the beta. Ready to make history.
Yeah. But we're actually creating tools to facilitate this. So like even the city building is actually player dependent. So there are like these spirit entities called wakas, which are around the world. And then you can claim a waka as a village, kind of as a guild. And then once you claim it and you make weekly offerings to this, you can actually create your own village, which is dependent on the culture that you pick and the resources that you have around. And in this village, you can build, for example, temples dedicated to the gods you want to worship. And then you can expand to claim other wakas. And that's a bit of a potential competitive element because you don't actually fight people, but you kind of compete for the best gifts. It's a bit more like bribery to the other spirits in the wilderness. And that creates a bit of a competition. And another thing too is that the world of Wagadu shifts. So every few weeks, the islands of Wagadu change, and islands that have been claimed stay in the game, and islands that haven't been claimed might disappear. So like it's very dynamic, and the whole world is literally changing based on what people do, like how the different guilds interact. So you'll be creating the story, no storyline from us.
Okay, that is amazing. Wow, that's so incredible. I'm so excited. I don't think I've been this excited for a game release since ever.
Nice.
Wow, that's so incredible, Allan. I mean, I've done quite a bit of research on the MMORPG side of the Wagadu Chronicles, but what you're telling me now is very refreshing because it's not something that I knew. And it's definitely something that I think is super, super conducive to a fresher approach to the MMORPG environment. There's no shortage of RPGs, MMORPGs specifically, like Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft and the other ones. But something like this is such a fresh, amazing take. I really, really appreciate that. And what I also want to know is, we mentioned combat, so I have two questions for you actually, and you can answer them in any order you would like.
Yeah.
Combat, how is combat? Obviously, PvE is probably going to be a pretty significant component of the game, but also PvP as well. I don't know how that's going to play out. And then also, a very simple one: is there going to be player housing?
Yes. So for the player housing, it's pretty straightforward one. There will be player housing. It's very important because role players love player housing, and there's a reason, because it creates like such a connection, and you can create this space where to role play with others about your own life, show off who you are and your history. So yes, we'll have that. There'll be a bit of a difference though, because we're going to have African compounds. That's one thing, like a big difference between kind of pre-colonial African housing and some other parts of the world. So actually your housing is never going to be an independent building. It's always going to be part of a group of houses, kind of a little circle of houses that you go in. Yeah, and you always have neighbors, so it's kind of a bit more social, and you have like a bit of a shared garden in the middle of the compound.
I love that. Yeah,
yes.
Allan, you will never fully realize how much I have ruined my life over trying to get a house in Final Fantasy XIV. Because player housing in Final Fantasy XIV is finite. So I'll literally spend most of my day sitting in front of a property that I want every day for a month, hoping that the person who lived there will like not log in long enough and it'll get demolished, or they'll just for whatever reason sell their house. And and eventually I kind of and I used to stream it as well. People were like, Nick, don't you want to like actually play the game? And I was like, no, I want this house. Okay, player housing is...
I understand.
Yeah, you know the struggle. Player housing is very important to me, so I'm really glad that I don't have to worry about that.
Yes, you need to find join some village guild, but there will be a lot of space. And as I said, Wagadu 2 is kind of flexible and changes too based on what players do. So if you kind of claim a waka, like a wilderness spirit, and start a village, then you'll be able to build houses there. So you create space basically for. It takes some work, and you have to actually find the good right resources for the spirit, but then you can build around it. So eventually, yes. And on the combat topic, for PvE is very important. Agreed. And basically, what's going to happen is that the game has a turn-based combat, so a bit like D&D basically. Although there'll be some differences, there's going to be an action point system.
So like
you can use them to... Yeah, actually, that's a good example.
Okay. Oh, yes.
Those are kind of one of the very few MMOs that has turn-based combat.
Yeah.
One difference is that we are going to have synchronous. It's going to be actions which trigger in a synchronous fashion, which means that whereas in Wakfu or Dofus you have to kind of everybody acts, so it's like your turn, then my turn, then their turn, and so on. In the Wagadu Chronicles, there's like preparation phase, so everybody prepares the action, and then they all trigger at the same time.
Okay.
So it's going to be a bit faster. So if you have like 10 players, you're not going to be waiting for 10 people to go down the initiative. It's more like everybody picks at the same time, and then they trigger at the same time. There's a bit of an order, but it's almost at the same time. So that's kind of a main difference from Dofus.
Okay,
but it's similar.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I loved that in Dofus as well, and also like Divinity Original Sin. So that's pretty cool. And then I wanted to ask, what kind of RPG elements are you going to introduce to the Wagadu Chronicles that kind of separate it from other contemporary MMOs? Are there going to be things like hunger, people needing to sleep, things like that?
So not that much. Like survival elements are not very strong. It's going to be more like traditional role-playing elements. Like for instance, one random one I can mention is that clothing is very much about fashion. Well, actually, we're currently working on that feature, and then just 3 of the slots on your body are for utility for combat or to use items to do things. Basically, your hands. And then your neck, and then the rest, like the bunch of slots, just for fashion. Like you can just wear jewelry and clothing. So we don't even have the concept of transmog in the game, because you don't need transmog, because you can basically wear like your fabulous feathers clothes and go to do whatever, go to work or fight even with those clothes, because most of the items are just aesthetics. It's just you showing off, expressing yourself. And that's one example of the more role-playing focus.
That's amazing. I bankrupt myself in Final Fantasy XIV every day of my life by buying transmogs, glamours in Final Fantasy 14 because actually the King Hellfire, who's in chat, he just recently got into Final Fantasy 14. And when he was a low level, he kept on crying about how he looked like I don't know what he said. He looked like a milkmaid or something for like up to 20 levels, and I was like, we need to get you to glamour. And my friends and I, who are all much higher level, we literally spent like inordinate sums of in-game money just making him look like a normal person. So I'm really glad it is important. Thank you, Allan. I'm glad you understand the struggle. You can tell we were actually making a joke about it in Final Fantasy 14. You can tell that there is some queer influence in this game because, you know, you don't have to look like a level 1 adventurer from any standard MMORPG at any given time. Yeah, that's incredible, Allan. And I also see that we have gone about 13 minutes over time. I don't want to keep you too long. I'm sure you've got like other things to do. If you have any kind of like things you want to talk about quickly before we wrap up, or you know, questions you want to ask or concepts you want to talk about of the game, let's do that. What do you have in mind?
I think one last thing I want to say is just people not to be scared by the setting in some way, because I know I've received 2 emails, letters or so on, people asking like, you know, can I come into this place without disrespecting your culture or the cultures of the teammates, because I don't belong
asked that
to
as
this
well.
culture. Yeah, and I think that kind of came up too. And I actually even wrote a chapter at the very beginning of the book of the Child and the Oath. I think it's literally the first couple of pages where I cover the topic of like, is this appropriation, right? Like if I go, especially as a white person, is this right? Or is this actually an experience that's meant to be for Afro-descendants or people of... And I think it's of course, a super important question to ask. And what I say is there's always things and spaces that are exclusive to minorities. So I understand, like I have been rejected from the lesbian party before, and I understand, because it's like, as a cisgender man, like there's, even as a gay man, there's still things I don't go through. And I understand that sometimes like queer women need their own space to, you know, talk about their own things and feel 100% safe from certain, you know, other parts of society. But this is actually not the way the Wagadu Chronicles is. So even if it has definitely some healing properties, and I know there's a lot going on, obviously some wonderful messages from like queer Ugandan folks, or like, you know, queer black folks from other parts. Yeah, that was actually really touching. And I think there is this in the Wagadu Chronicles, but it is meant as well as an open experience for everyone, you know, no matter where you come from, to learn and discover more about these cultures and to increase. So if you join, even as a non-Afro-descendant in the Wagadu Chronicles, you're actually contributing to this anti-colonialist act of saying like what was trying to be destroyed by the colonial masters, you know, 1 or 2 centuries ago. We all together, including the descendants of the colonial masters, we're actually celebrating it around the table or, you know, on a video game. And that's kind of the best thing for me and the team, like to see no matter where you come from, no matter who your ancestors are, like you can, of course, with respect and not wanting to mock the experience. So there's maybe one thing I always say, like if you decide to cosplay, don't do blackface. And I know it's obvious, but I just say it.
We need to say it anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, we had like actually one stream, we had like a lovely stream where we had a white player who like did a Swala cosplay with horns and so on, but of course
no
kept their skin white, because it's just a matter of like the historical context where we are. We all know that painting as a white person, I mean,
it is fantasy, but also you can't separate it from the real world that we live in too.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. The issues, like we cannot separate from actual blackface for now. Maybe in 200 years we'll be all over that, but for now we're not, maybe. But the historical context does not allow for that, right? But overall, yes, please, you're welcome. And so that's my message. And you know, Wagadu has been made for everyone. So we love to see you in the world.
I actually just found it here. The chapter that says, as a non-POC or someone who isn't black, is playing this cultural appropriation, and there's a really lovely note here, and then a note to the reader, and then donates to a black charity section, and I think that's really brilliant. I know from experience, especially obviously living in Africa, that these narratives can sometimes be, not sometimes, most of the time, be incredibly upsetting for indigenous people of color. Obviously, living in a country like South Africa, I know that there are a lot of white people, and and I refer to myself as a descendant of colonizers because that's exactly what I am. I'm like, it's not like a slur if I call myself a descendant of colonizers. It's just a historical fact. That there is a modicum of care and respect that needs to be held with these narratives, but I'm very happy to know that there is a place in which we can explore these narratives as non-POC without disrespecting those cultures. And where I also think it's important is to understand the difference between characterization and caricature. So like, for example, my character in the Wagadu, I've decided that I really want to play an Emere of the lion blood lineage, the lion blood culture rather. It's important for me to not caricature an accent or caricature stereotypes and things like that, and to actually have self-actualized kind of paradigm-safe narratives for a character that aren't jokes or patronizing or condescending. So I really like that. I think that's awesome. But on that note, Allan, and this is my final question to you.
Best approach.
Yes, I hope so. So I have one final question for you, Allan. Is there room in the it's not the MMORPG, sorry, the tabletop role-playing section of Wagadu for non-denizens of Wagadu? For example, if I wanted to come in, obviously everything can be homebrewed, but is there an incorporated method by which, for example, a half-elf from Neverwinter in Faerun, the Dungeons and Dragons campaign setting, continent and environment, to suddenly find themselves in Wagadu as like a traveler or an outsider from a different world or something like that? How does that play into the game itself?
So interesting question, and there's two things I can say. So one is, of course, homebrew,
homebrew, yeah, of course.
Yeah. But officially, there isn't, and there's a reason for this.
Licensing?
And I wanted, well, that could be, no, but actually, when looking at the different cultures, of Wagadu, we could have created kind of like some more, white-inspired, like Afrikaans-inspired culture, for instance, right? So like, let's add these people as well, or European-inspired. There's been European minorities throughout the African continent. That was not in pre-colonial, that was more post-colonial times, but they were, so that could have been something. Just looking exclusively at Africa, I'm saying we could have still done that. And there's a reason why the focus was more on the indigenous cultures.
Because it's not for us.
No, not. It's for everyone. It's for everyone. But the thing is, like, I did not want people for example, like of white descent or white people to only roleplay that and not to explore all the other cultures. Like the goal of the Wagadu Chronicles is to explore indigenous cultures and to show like how big they are, like how strong and how inclusive, like how you can actually tell your story even as a non-black person. You can tell some story and find something interesting and kind of role play something that's really personal and fits you even within these spaces. So it's kind of like a celebration of how powerful and how large these cultures are and how there's room, because we've always seen Western fantasy as the umbrella of fantasies. Like no matter where you come from, you're Asian, you're black or so on, this is the default. Play Western elf, play dwarf and so on. What I'm saying, like there's other umbrellas out there, and this is like a black umbrella, but there's enough room under it for other people, non-black folks, to roleplay. And it would have been a kind of an easy shortcut to say like, oh, you can just bring in like your white elf or your white dwarf and so on, and then we just have like the indigenous element relegated again to the side. And more dangerously, we could have even had some white savior narratives coming in.
Oh yeah.
Because if you're role-playing like this white elf that is like saving everybody, and it's like everybody's like, oh, thank you, all the black Wagadians thanking. It's like we want it to be a fully black experience. So that's the reason. Who knows, in the long term it might grow more, we might select different people, but for now definitely the focus is like, let's celebrate indigenous cultures. And I've seen there's other settings now coming out there with like American, like pre-Columbian American indigenous cultures and so on, focus on those cultures and saying, hey, welcome you. I think Japan has done this in the past already. Like now we almost don't think twice if we role play a samurai or something. Like very rarely we'd be like, oh, am I allowed to play this, right? I think that's super cool for that context. Always check the origins, the intentions of the creators. But this is the goal of the Wagadu Chronicles, to kind of create this space that is like outwards looking, is for everybody to roleplay.
Yeah, and I mean, when I mentioned earlier that it's not for us, obviously us being, you know, me as a member of the white demographic, I don't mean it as an exclusion, just not as a focus. And I think that's I think that's actually I think that's nice. I don't feel excluded at all. But I also understand that my narrative, my cultural background is not the focus, and I enjoy that and I appreciate that, because I think that a lot of Eurocentric narratives do take the podium and do take the focus in a lot of game development and media development in general. And we are missing the very important perspective and inclusion of Afrocentric dynamics, which are robust and dynamic in their own right, that I think could promote a lot of catalysts for creativity and fresh perspectives in an industry that is inherently Eurocentrically dominated. So I really think that's amazing. I love that.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Allan. And thanks, chat, for joining us. If you are watching this on YouTube, you're welcome to ask some questions in the comments, and I will relay them to Allan when I get a chance, or if I can, I'll probably answer them myself. And for those who are watching us live, really appreciate everyone being here. Thanks for engaging. And I'm going to post that link one more time for obviously the Kickstarter. Please, everybody in chat, consider backing this project with whatever tier you can. And if you would like access to the free 300-page PDF for the player's handbook, let me give you the link to the Wagadu Chronicles main website, and then there's actually a link there where you can subscribe via email. And I don't think I've ever subscribed or wanted to subscribe to a newsletter so much in my life.
We don't spam, no spam. Okay. No breakfast pictures.
Okay, that's for the backers. Hey, like the little extra. Alrighty. Thank you so much, Allan. Thanks, chat, and we'll definitely keep chatting. Allan, I have so many more questions that I won't bother you with all at once. And chat, I'll see you all probably tomorrow, I think. I must check my streaming schedule, but I'll let you all know in the Discord and Twitter. And Allan, where can we find you before I let you go? On Twitter, Instagram?
So we're very active on Twitter and Instagram. So basically, the Wagadu Chronicle without S for Twitter because it didn't fit. Wagadu Chronicle. And then Instagram, Wagadu Chronicles, and the website that you shared already, the Wagadu Chronicles. And we're active. The newsletter is great because we share big updates. So if, for instance, we have new versions of the 5e lore book, or we have any open future alphas for the MMORPG, that's going to be newsletter and social media. So yeah, we'll be sharing all info that. And thanks so much for having me, Nick. I love what you're doing in general, like all of the activism and the queerness and pro-African, pro-indigenous and everything. So it was just so amazing to be here to talk about the Wagadu Chronicles.
That's very kind of you, Allan. It's an absolute pleasure. Let me just type this last one in chat for you, one of the links. I think this is your account on Instagram, Terkudi?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Allan. And I'll see you soon. Have a great one. Bye for now.